A single grey squirrel buries up to 10,000 nuts in a single year, every one of them in a different spot, not one pile, not one tree, not one vault, 10,000 separate positions. This looks like chaos from above, random digging scattered across an entire territory. It is the opposite of chaos. It is portfolio construction executed by paw. Wealth managers have a name for this discipline. They call it asset allocation. The squirrel just calls it Tuesday and has been doing it for millions of years. Here is the problem every hoarding animal faces every single autumn. Winter is coming. Every visible source of food will disappear. Whatever gets gathered now has to survive 4 to 5 months of scarcity. And it has to survive something else at the same time. Foxes, hawks, rival squirrels watching from the next tree over. Every one of them wants exactly what has just been buried in the dirt. If a squirrel buried its entire winter supply in one location, a single discovery ends the entire strategy. One breach, total default. No recovery period, no second chance before spring. So evolution built a hedge against exactly this scenario. Spread the risk, multiply the vaults, separate every position from every other. Make total loss in a single catastrophic event mathematically close to impossible. No insurance policy, no safety net waiting underneath, just distribution, done early, done deliberately. This is called scatter hoarding, and it is anything but random. Every cache is an independent position, isolated from every other cache. No single predator, no single storm, no single theft can take it all at once. Biologists have tracked individual squirrels burying inventory across more than 100 separate locations in a single season. Some caches sit less than a meter apart, others are separated by entire fields. Compare that to a hedge fund manager heading into 2008. One who held only equities lost nearly everything within 6 months. One who held equities alongside gold and long bonds came out the other side intact. That difference was never about luck. It was about architecture, built before the crisis arrived. The exact same architecture a squirrel builds instinctively every autumn without exception. But scattering the wealth creates an immediate second problem. How do you remember 10,000 separate, individually meaningless locations? A map that complex should be far beyond what a brain this small could hold. The answer is a mechanism researchers call spatial memory chunking. Squirrels do not memorize 10,000 random points on a landscape. They organize their caches into categories first, then remember the categories. High-value nuts are grouped into one mental cluster. Lower-value nuts are grouped into another, held with lower priority. Each category gets its own retrieval strategy, its own urgency, its own timeline. This is precisely how institutional portfolios are structured and managed. Not asset by asset, category by category, tier by tier. Low-risk capital preservation, medium-risk growth positions, high-risk speculative bets. A wealth manager does not track every single dollar individually, line by line. They track exposure by category, by risk band, by expected time horizon. The squirrel arrived at risk tiering using a brain roughly the size of a walnut. But there is a second, sharper decision hidden inside the first one. Not every nut in the forest is worth the same amount of storage time. Some decay quickly, some barely decay at all, and the squirrel knows precisely which is which. Acorns from red oak trees germinate the following spring, right on schedule. The moment they sprout, the stored nutrition inside collapses almost instantly. So squirrels eat those first, fast, before the underlying value has a chance to disappear. White oak acorns behave differently. They sprout almost immediately after they fall. So before burying them for long-term storage, squirrels do something remarkable. They bite out the embryo, the exact part of the seed responsible for germination. One precise bite arrests the sprouting process completely. The nut can no longer grow, which means it can no longer spoil. It simply sits, frozen in value, patiently, until the squirrel actually needs it. Financial engineers have a name for stripping decay out of a stored asset. It's called protecting purchasing power against erosion over time. Inflation works the same way in reverse. A slow bite taken out of stored value every single day. The squirrel isn't only choosing which assets to hold long term. It is actively modifying the asset before storage, engineering out the risk, converting something naturally perishable into something closer to gold. This is what genuine diversification is actually protecting against. Not only theft, not only predators circling the territory, the quiet, constant, invisible erosion of value sitting completely still. There is one more layer to this system, and it may be the most important one. Squirrels don't hoard the same amount every single year. In years when natural food sources are predicted to be scarce, they hoard aggressively more. This links to a phenomenon called mast seeding, where oak trees produce enormous quantities of acorns in some years and almost none in others. Squirrels appear to anticipate these swings, adjusting hoarding behavior ahead of the shortage. This is counter-cyclical positioning, executed months before the crisis is visible. Sophisticated capital allocators do the exact same thing before a downturn. They increase their defensive holdings before the recession officially begins, not after. By the time a bank run is public, by the time headlines confirm the crisis, the positioning window has already closed for almost everyone. The squirrel that waits for visible scarcity before hoarding does not survive the winter. Now, here is a detail about this animal that almost nobody knows. Squirrels dig fake holes. Elaborate, convincing, completely empty holes, dug purely for an audience. Field researchers have documented this behavior directly, repeatedly. When a squirrel senses it is being watched by a rival, from a nearby tree, it performs a full, convincing burial ritual with no nut buried inside it at all. Family offices execute something almost identical structurally. Layered trusts, shell holding companies, positions spread across multiple jurisdictions. Most of the structure is genuinely real. Some of it exists purely as deliberate misdirection. The goal isn't always to hide an asset completely from view. Sometimes the goal is simply to make the real target harder to identify. A rival watching 10 simultaneous transactions can never be fully certain which one actually matters. The decoy costs almost nothing to build relative to what it protects, and it defends the real position without requiring a single direct confrontation. No fight, no loss. Just a rival, digging furiously at nothing, burning daylight it cannot recover. There is one final layer of design most people miss entirely. Not every cache sits at the same distance from the den. Some are buried close, within easy reach. Others sit far out, deliberately harder to access. The nearby caches function as short-term reserves, retrieved constantly through the season. They're the equivalent of cash and near-cash holdings, ready on demand. The distant caches are rarely touched. They exist purely as a last resort for the worst weeks of winter. This is liquidity tiering, built directly into the geography of the hoard. A portfolio manager separates holdings the same way, by how fast they can be accessed. Cash for this week, bonds for this quarter, illiquid assets locked away for a crisis that may never come. The squirrel never confuses the two. It never digs up a distant reserve for a problem the nearby reserve can solve. That discipline, knowing which reserve to spend and which to protect, is half of what keeps it alive. Here is what should genuinely unsettle you about everything just described. None of it required intelligence in the human sense of the word. No squirrel has ever read a finance textbook or sat through a single economics lecture. This behavior is coded, inherited, entirely automatic, passed down across generations. Which means the strategy isn't clever in the way we usually define clever. It is mathematically inevitable, arrived at purely through evolutionary pressure and repeated failure. Any system forced to survive an unpredictable threat, with no reliable way to know exactly where that threat will come from, converges on the same four-part solution. Spread the risk. Categorize it. Disguise it. Protect it from decay. That is true for a squirrel standing alone in a frozen public park. It is true for a sovereign wealth fund quietly managing trillions of dollars. And it is true for you if your entire net worth currently sits in a single account. The economists who formalized modern portfolio theory in the 20th century were awarded mathematical proofs and Nobel Prizes for the work. The squirrel only needed to survive one winter, and it arrived at the answer first. You now understand exactly why no single vault survives sustained contact with a determined predator. Scattering isn't caution. It is a coherent, deliberate strategy, categorized by risk, engineered against decay, tiered by how quickly it can be reached. Even the smallest creature in the forest already understood all of that, long before any of us did. No advisor, no model, no spreadsheet. Just 100,000 years of winters that did not forgive mistakes.